Chapter 8, Part 2 of Agriculture for Beginners. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. Agriculture for Beginners by Charles William Burkett. Chapter 8, Farm Crops, Part 2. Section 40, Sweet Potatoes. The roots of sweet potatoes are put on the market in various forms. Aside from the form in which they are ordinarily sold, some potatoes are dried and then ground into flour, some are canned, and some are used to make starch. Some furnish a kind of sugar called glucose, and some are even used to make alcohol. The fact that there are over 80 varieties of potatoes shows the popularity of the plant. Now it is evident that all these varieties cannot be equally desirable. Hence the wise grower will select his varieties with prudent forethought. He should study the market, his soil, and his seed. See Section 18. 4 months of mild weather, months free from frost and cold winds, are necessary for the growing of sweet potatoes. In a mild climate, almost any loose, well-drained soil will produce them. A light, sandy loam, however, gives a cleaner potato and one, therefore, that sells better. The sweet potato draws potash, nitrogen, and phosphoric acid from the soil. But in applying these as fertilizers, the grower must study and know his own soil. If he does not, he may waste both money and plant food by the addition of elements already present in sufficient quantity in the soil. The only way to come to reliable conclusions as to the needs of the soil is to try 2 or 3 different kinds of fertilizers on plats of the same soil during the same season, and notice the resulting crop of potatoes. Sweet potatoes will do well after almost any of the usual field crops. This caution, however, should be borne in mind. Potatoes should not follow a sod. This is because sods are often thick with cutworms, one of the serious enemies of the potato. It is needless to say that the ground must be kept clean by thorough cultivation until the vines take full possession of the field. In harvesting, extreme care should be used to avoid cutting and bruising the potato, since bruises are as dangerous to a sweet potato as to an apple, and render decay almost a certainty. Lay aside all bruised potatoes for immediate use. For shipment, the potatoes should be graded and packed with care. An extra outlay of 50 cents a barrel often brings a return of $1 a barrel in the market. One fact often neglected by Southern growers who raise potatoes for a Northern market is that the Northern markets demand a potato that will cook dry and mealy, and that they will not accept the juicy, sugary potato so popular in the South. The storage of sweet potatoes presents difficulties owing to their great tendency to decay under the influence of the ever-present fungi and bacteria. This tendency can be met by preventing bruises and by keeping the bin free from rotting potatoes. The potatoes should be cleaned, and after the moisture has been dried off, they should be stored in a dry, warm place. The sweet potato vine makes a fair quality of hay, and with proper precaution may be used for ensilage. Small, defective, unsaleable potatoes are rich in sugar and starch, and are therefore good stock food. Since they contain so much water, they must be used only as an aid to other diet. Section 41. White or Irish potatoes. Maize or Indian corn and potatoes are the 2 greatest gifts in the way of food that America has bestowed on the other nations. Since their adoption in the 16th century as a new food from the recently discovered America, white potatoes have become one of the world's most important crops. No grower will harvest large crops of potatoes unless he chooses a soil that suits the plant, selects his seed carefully, cultivates thoroughly, feeds his land sufficiently, and sprays regularly. The soil should be free from potato scab. This disease remains inland for several years. Hence, if land is known to have any form of scab in it, do not plant potatoes in such land. Select for this crop a deep and moderately light, sandy loam, which has an open subsoil, and which is rich in humus. The soil must be light enough for the potatoes, or tubers, to enlarge easily, and dry enough to prevent rot or blight or other diseases. Potato soil should be so close-grained that it will hold moisture during a dry spell, and yet so well drained that the tubers will not be hurt by too much moisture in wet weather. If the land selected for potatoes is lacking in humus, fine compost or well-rotted manure will greatly increase the yield. However, it should be remembered that green manure makes a good home for the growth of scab germs. Hence it is safest to apply this sort of manure in the fall, or, better still, use a heavy dressing of manure on the crop which the potatoes are to follow. Leguminous crops supply both humus and nitrogen, and, at the same time, improve the subsoil. Therefore such crops are excellent to go immediately before potatoes. If land is well supplied with humus, commercial fertilizers are perhaps safer than manure, for when these fertilizers are used, the amount of plant food is more easily regulated. Select a fertilizer that is rich in potash. For gardens, unleached wood ashes make a valuable fertilizer because they supply potash. Early potatoes need more fertilization than do late ones. While potatoes do best on rich land, they should not be overfed, for a too heavy growth of foliage is likely to cause blight. Be careful to select seed from sound potatoes which are entirely free from scab. Get the kinds that thrive best in the section in which they are to be planted, and which suit best the markets in which they are to be sold. Seed potatoes should be kept in a cool place so that they will not sprout before planting time. As a rule, consumers prefer a smooth, regularly shaped, shallow-eyed white or flesh-colored potato, which is mealy when cooked. Therefore, select seed tubers with these qualities. It seems proved that when whole potatoes are used for seed, the yield is larger than when sliced potatoes are planted. It is, of course, too costly to plant whole potatoes, but it is a good practice to cause plants to thrive by planting large seed pieces. Like other crops, potatoes need a thoroughly prepared seed bed and intelligent cultivation. Break the land deep. Then go over it with an ordinary harrow until all clods are broken and the soil is fine and well closed. The rows should be at least 3 feet from one another, and the seeds placed from 12 to 18 inches apart in the row and covered to a depth of 3 or 4 inches. A late crop should be planted deeper than an early one. Before the plants come up, it is well to go over the field once or twice with a harrow so as to kill all weeds. Do not fail to save moisture by frequent cultivation. After the plants start to grow, all cultivation should be kept shallow, for the roots feed near the surface and should not be broken. Cultivate as often as needed to keep down weeds and grass and to keep the ground fine. Allow potatoes to dry thoroughly before they are stored, but never allow them to remain long in the sunshine. Never dig them in damp weather, for the moisture clinging to them will cause them to rot. After the tubers are dry, store them in barrels or bins in a dry, cool, and dark place. Never allow them to freeze. Among the common diseases and insect pests that attack the leaves and stems of potato vines are early blight, late blight, brown rot, the flea beetle, and the potato beetle or potato bug. Spraying with Bordeaux mixture to which a small portion of Paris green has been added will control both the diseases and the pests. The spraying should begin when the plants are 5 or 6 inches high and should not cease until the foliage begins to die. Scab is a disease of the tubers. It may be prevented 1. By using seed potatoes that are free from scab, 2. By planting land in which there is no scab, and 3. By soaking the seed in formalin. See page 135. Section 42. Oats. The oat plant belongs to the grass family. It is a hardy plant and, under good conditions, a vigorous grower. It stands cold and wet better than any other cereal except possibly rye. Oats like a cool, moist climate. In warm climates, oats do best if they are sowed in the fall. In cooler sections, spring seeding is more generally practiced. There are a great many varieties of oats. No one variety is best adapted to all sections, but many varieties make fine crops in many sections. Any variety is desirable which has these qualities: the power to resist disease and insect enemies, heavy grains, thin hulls, good color, and suitability to local surroundings. As oats and rye make a better yield on poor land than any other cereals, some farmers usually plant these crops on their poorest lands. However, no land is too good to be used for so valuable a crop as oats. Oats require a great deal of moisture, hence light, sandy soils are not so well adapted to this crop as are the sandy loams and fine clay loams with their closer and heavier texture. If oats are to be planted in the spring, the ground should be broken in the fall, winter, or early spring, so that no delay may occur at seeding time. But to have a thoroughly settled, compact seed bed, the breaking of the land should be done at least a month before the seeding, and it will help greatly to run over the land with a disc harrow immediately after the breaking. Oats may be planted by scattering them broadcast or by means of a drill. The drill is better, because the grains are more uniformly distributed and the depth of the planting is better regulated. The seed should be covered from 1½ to 2 inches deep. In a very dry season 3 inches may not be too deep. The amount of seed needed to the acre varies considerably, but generally the seeding is from 2 to 3 bushels an acre. On poor lands 2 bushels will be a fair average seeding. On good lands as much as 3 bushels should be used. This crop fits in well over wide areas with various rotations. As the purpose of all rotation is to keep the soil productive, oats should alternate every few years with one of the nitrogen-gathering crops. In the South, cowpeas, soybeans, clovers, and vetches may be used in this rotation. In the North and West, the clovers mixed with timothy hay make a useful combination for this purpose. Spring-sowed oats, since they have a short growing season, need their nitrogenous plant food in a form which can be quickly used. To supply this nitrogen, a top dressing of nitrate of soda or sulfate of lime is helpful. The plant can gather its food quickly from either of these two. As fall-sowed oats have, of course, a longer growing season, the nitrogen can be supplied by well-rotted manure, blood, tankage, or fish scrap. Use barnyard manure carefully. Do not apply too much just before seeding, and use only thoroughly rotted manure. It is always desirable to have a bountiful supply of humus in land on which oats are to be planted. The time of harvesting will vary with the use which is to be made of the oats. If the crop is to be threshed, the harvesting should be done when the kernels have passed out of the milk into the hard dough state. The lower leaves of the stalks will at this time have turned yellow, and the kernels will be plump and full. Do not, however, wait too long, for if you do the grain will shatter and the straw lose in feeding value. On the other hand, if the oats are to be cut for hay, it is best to cut them while the grains are still in the milk stage. At this stage the leaves are still green and the plants are rich in protein. Oats should be cured quickly. It is important that threshed oats should be dry before they are stored. Should they on being stored contain moisture, they will be likely to heat and to discolor. Any discoloring will reduce their value. Nor should oats ever be allowed to remain long in the fields, no matter how well they may seem to be shocked. The dew and the rain will injure their value by discoloring them more or less. Oats are muscle builders rather than fat formers. Hence they are a valuable ration for work animals, dairy cows, and breeding stock. Section 43. Rye. Rye has the power of gathering its food from a wider area than most other plants. Of course, then, it is a fine crop for poor land, and farmers often plant it only on worn land. However, it is too good a cereal to be treated in so ungenerous a fashion. As a cover crop for poor land, it adds much humus to the soil and makes capital grazing. There are 2 types of rye, the winter and the spring. The winter type is chiefly grown in this country. Rye seeds should be bought as near home as possible, for this plant thrives best when the new crop grows under the same conditions as the seed crop. Rye will grow on almost any soil that is drained. Soils that are too sandy for wheat will generally yield good crops of rye. Clay soils, however, are not adapted to the plant, nor to the grazing for which the plant is generally sowed. For winter rye, the land should be broken from 4 to 6 inches. Harrows should follow the plows until the land is well pulverized. In some cold prairie lands, however, rye is put in with a grain drill before a plow removes the stubble from the land. The purpose of planting in this way is to let the stubble protect the young plants from cold, driving winds. Rye should go into the ground earlier than wheat. In cold, bleak climates, as well as on poor land, the seeding should be early. The young plants need to get rooted and topped before cold weather sets in. The only danger in very early planting is that leaf rust sometimes attacks the forward crop. Of course, the earlier the rye is ready for fall and winter pasturage, the better. If a drill is used for planting, a seeding of from 3 to 4 pecks to the acre should give a good stand. In case the seeds are to be sown broadcast, a bushel or a bushel and a half for every acre is needed. The seed should be covered as wheat seed is and the ground rolled. Rye is generally used as a grazing or a soiling crop. Therefore its value will depend largely on its vigorous growth in stems and leaves. To get this growth, liberal amounts of nitrogenous fertilizer will have to be applied unless the land is very rich. Put barnyard manure on the land just after the first breaking and disc the manure into the soil. Acid phosphate and kainite added to the manure may pay handsomely. A spring top dressing of nitrate of soda is usually helpful. Rye has a stiff straw and does not fall or lodge so badly as some of the other cereals. As soon as rye that is meant for threshing is cut, it should be put up in shocks until it is thoroughly dry. Begin the cutting when the kernels are in a tough dough state. The grain should never stand long in the shocks. Section 44. Barley. Barley is one of the oldest crops known to man. The old historian Pliny says that barley was the first food of mankind. Modern man, however, prefers wheat and corn and potatoes to barley, and as a food this ancient crop is in America turned over to the lower animals. Brewers use barley extensively in making malt liquors. Barley grows in nearly all sections of our country, but a few states, namely Minnesota, California, Wisconsin, Iowa, and North and South Dakota, are seeding large areas to this crop. For malting purposes, the barley raised on rather light, friable, porous soil is best. Soils of this kind are likely to produce a medium yield of bright grain. Fertile loamy and clay soils make generally a heavier yield of barley, but the grain is dark and fit only to be fed to stock. Barley is a shallow feeder, and can reach only such plant food as is found in the top soil. So its food should always be put within reach by a thorough breaking, harrowing, and mellowing of the soil, and by fertilizing if the soil is poor. Barley has been successfully raised both by irrigation and by dry farming methods. It requires a better prepared soil than the other grain crops. It makes a fine yield when it follows some crop that has received a heavy dressing of manure. Capital yields are produced after alfalfa or after root crops. This crop usually matures within 100 days from its seeding. When the crop is to be sold to brewers, a grain rich in starch should be secured. Barley intended for malting should be fertilized to this end. Many experiments have shown that a fertilizer which contains much potash will produce starchy barley. If the barley be intended for stock, you should breed so as to get protein in the grain and in the stalk. Hence, barley which is to be fed should be fertilized with mixtures containing nitrogen and phosphoric acid. Young barley plants are more likely to be hurt by cold than either wheat or oats. Hence barley ought not to be seeded until all danger of frost is over. The seed should be covered deeper than the seeds of wheat or oats. 4 inches is perhaps an average depth for covering. But the covering will vary with the time of planting, with the kind of ground, with the climate, and with the nature of the seed. Fewer seeds will be needed if the barley is planted by means of a drill. Like other cereals, barley should not be grown continuously on the same land. It should take its place in a well-planned rotation. It may profitably follow potatoes or other hoed crops, but it should not come first after wheat, oats, or rye. Barley should be harvested as soon as most of its kernels have reached the hard dough state. It is more likely to shatter its grain than are other cereals, and it should therefore be handled with care. It must also be watched to prevent its sprouting in the shocks. Be sure to put few bundles in the shock, and to cap the shock securely enough to keep out dew and rain. If possible, the barley should be threshed directly from the shock, as much handling will occasion a serious loss from shattering. Section 45. Sugar plants. In the United States there are 3 sources from which sugar is obtained, namely, the sugar maple, the sugar beet, and the sugar cane. In the early days of our country, considerable quantities of maple syrup and maple sugar were made. This was the first source of sugar. Then sugar cane began to be grown. Later the sugar beet was introduced. Maple products. In many states, syrup and sugar are still made from maple sap. In the spring, when the sap is flowing freely, maple trees are tapped and spouts are inserted. Through these spouts the sap flows into vessels set to catch it. The sap is boiled in evaporating pans and made into either syrup or sugar. 4 gallons of sap yield about 1 pound of sugar. A single tree yields from 2 to 6 pounds of sugar in a season. The sap cannot be kept long after it is collected. Practice and skill are needed to produce an attractive and palatable grade of syrup or sugar. Sugar beets. The sugar beet is a comparatively new root crop in America. The amount of sugar that can be obtained from beets varies from 12 to 20%. The richness in sugar depends somewhat on the variety grown and on the soil and the climate. So far, most of our sugar beet seeds have been brought over from Europe. Some of our planters are now, however, gaining the skill and knowledge needed to grow these seeds. It is of course important to grow seeds that will produce beets containing much sugar. These beets do well in a great variety of soils if the land is rich, well prepared, and well drained, and has a porous subsoil. Beets cannot grow to a large size in hard land. Hence, deep plowing is very necessary for this crop. The soil should be loose enough for the whole body of the beet to remain underground. Some growers prefer spring plowing and some fall plowing, but all agree that the land should not be turned less than 8 or 10 inches. The subsoil, however, should not be turned up too much at the first deep plowing. Too much care cannot be taken to make the seed bed firm and mellow and to have it free from clods. If the soil is dry at planting time, and if there is a likelihood of high winds, the seed bed may be rolled with profit. Experienced growers use from 10 to 12 pounds of seeds to an acre. It is better to use too many rather than too few seeds, for it is easy to thin out the plants, but rather difficult to transplant them. The seeds are usually drilled in rows about 20 inches apart. Of course, if the soil is rather warm and moist at planting time, fewer seeds will be needed than when germination is likely to be slow. A good rotation should always be planned for this beet. A very successful one is as follows. For the first year, corn heavily fertilized with stable manure. For the second year, sugar beets. For the third year, oats or barley. For the fourth year, clover, then go back again to corn. In addition to keeping the soil fertile, there are two gains from this rotation. First, the clean cultivation of the corn crop just ahead of the beets destroys many of the weed seeds. Second, the beets must be protected from too much nitrogen in the soil, for an excess of nitrogen makes a beet too large to be rich in sugar. The manure, heavily applied to the corn, will leave enough nitrogen and other plant food in the soil to make a good crop of beets and avoid any danger of an excess. When the outside leaves of the beet take on a yellow tinge and drop to the ground, the beets are ripe. The mature beets are richer in sugar than the immature, therefore they should not be harvested too soon. They may remain in the ground without injury for some time after they are ripe. Cold weather does not injure the roots unless it is accompanied by freezing and thawing. The beets are harvested by sugar beet pullers or by hand. If the roots are to be gathered by hand, they are usually loosened by plowing on each side of them. If the roots are stored, they should be put in long, narrow piles and covered with straw and earth to protect them from frost. A ventilator placed at the top of the pile will enable the heat and moisture to escape. If the beet gets too warm, they will ferment, and some of their sugar will be lost. Sugar cane. Sugar cane is grown along the Gulf of Mexico and on the South Atlantic coast. In Mississippi, in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, northern Louisiana, and in northern Texas, it is generally made into syrup. In southern Louisiana and southern Texas, the cane is usually crushed for sugar or for molasses. The sugar cane is a huge grass. The stalk, which is round, is from 1 to 2 inches in thickness. The stalks vary in color. Some are white, some yellow, some green, some red, some purple, and some black, while others are a mixture of 2 or 3 of these colors. As shown in Figure 214, the stalk has joints at distances of from 2 to 6 inches. These joints are called nodes, and the sections between the nodes are known as internodes. The internodes ripen from the roots upward, and as each ripens, it casts its leaves. The stalk, when ready for harvesting, has only a few leaves on the top. Under each leaf and on alternate sides of the cane a bud or eye forms. From this eye the cane is usually propagated, for while in tropical countries the cane forms seeds, yet these seeds are rarely fertile. When the cane is ripe, it is stripped of leaves, topped, and then cut to the ground with a knife. The sugar is contained in solution in the pith of the cane. Cane requires an enormous amount of water for its best growth, and where the rainfall is not great enough, the plants are irrigated. It requires from 75 to 100 gallons of water to make a pound of sugar. Cane does best where there is a rainfall of 2 inches a week. At the same time, a well-drained soil is necessary to make vigorous canes. The soils suited to this plant are those which contain large amounts of fertilizing material and which can hold much water. In southern Louisiana, alluvial loams and loamy clays are cultivated. In Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, light sandy soils, when properly fertilized and worked, make good crops. Cane is usually planted in rows from 5 to 6 feet apart. A trench is opened in the center of the row with a plow, and in this open furrow is placed a continuous line of stalks, which are carefully covered with plow, cultivator, or hoe. From 1 to 3 lines of stalks are placed in the furrow. From 2 to 6 tons of seed cane are needed for an acre. In favorable weather, the cane soon sprouts and cultivation begins. Cane should be cultivated at short intervals until the plants are large enough to shade the soil. In Louisiana, one planting of cane usually gives 2 crops. The first is called plant cane. The second is known as first-year stubble or ratoon. Sometimes second-year stubble is grown. In Louisiana, large quantities of tankage, cottonseed meal, and acid phosphate are used to fertilize cane fields. Each country has its own time for planting and harvesting. In Louisiana, for example, canes are planted from October to April. In the United States, cane is harvested each year because of frost, but in tropical countries the stalks are permitted to grow from 15 to 24 months. On many farms a small mill, the rollers of which are turned by horses, is used for crushing the juice out of the cane. The juice is then evaporated in a kettle or pan. This equipment is very cheap and can easily be operated by a small family. While these mills rarely extract more than 1/2 of the juice of the cane, the syrup made by them is very palatable and usually commands a good price. Costly machinery, which saves most of the juice, is used in the very large commercial sugar houses. End of chapter 8, part 2.